Here's a mental exercise for you. Imagine North Carolina, NC State, Duke, and Wake Forest fans all chanting ACC, ACC, not sarcastically, which is how folks do it today in reaction to SEC fans who pull for teams that aren't Alabama. I'm saying actual pride in the Big Four and pulling for your rival to win against an outsider. Turns out you don't have to imagine it, because that's how it used to be back in the 50s and 60s. So what changed? The Big Four tournament, which came about a decade following the aftermath of the Dixie Classic, and the recruitment of David Thompson.
The Triangle has the most unique landscape for sports. 3 major universities along Tobacco Road with rabid fan bases, a Stanley Cup champion, an NFL team right down the road, and heavily invested transplants. Not to mention an interesting mix of sports teams that were. Joe Ovies brings you a brief history of Triangle sports, a candid conversation with those who help shape why sports matters here.
Well, it's called A Brief History of Triangle Sports, so let's give you a brief history of how we got to the Big Four tournament in the 1970s. NC State hires Everett Case to be their basketball coach. Case is largely responsible for a good chunk of ACC traditions people hold dear to this day, including the Dixie Classic and the ACC tournament itself.
NC State flew the flags of its rivals outside the new Coliseum, but each banner might just as well have been flown at half-mast, because the odds of anyone winning in Everett Case's rally were as long as the hemlines of 1949. Case, the Gray Fox, made Reynolds Coliseum his personal henhouse in the Dixie Classic.
The Dixie Classic, which was his brainchild, was certainly an innovation. It was the finest holiday tournament in the nation.
At that time, even more popular than NCAA. The teams from all around the country were riding Everett. Let us play in your tournament.
I never shall forget that Dixie Classic when Oscar Robinson came in here and the Cincinnati team, which was #1 in the country. It was the best Dixie Classic we've ever had. State managed to beat Cincinnati in the semifinal round.
In 1964, Everett Case developed cancer and turned the team over to Press Maravich and Charlie Bryant. There would be one last hurrah for the Gray Fox in the ACC tournament of 1965, one of the last to be played here in Reynolds Coliseum. NC State upset mighty Duke.
We brought Everett out on the floor, and it was just such a great feeling to watch Everett reach up there for one more time and clip those nets, because he had done it so many times and set the precedent for excellence in the Atlantic Coast Conference.
Case died less than a year later, and so that he could wave to the Wolfpack team, he was buried along Highway 70. But his indomitable spirit lives in Reynolds Coliseum still.
The Dixie Classic shut down in 1961 thanks to a point-shaving scandal involving NC State and North Carolina. And this was not a small operation your buddy might have run out of a dorm. At one point, an NC State player allegedly had a gun drawn on him because someone lost some money.
Each December, the proud NC State program and the equally great Carolina program got to show their stuff at the Dixie Classic, a holiday tournament matching State and Carolina and the other Big Four schools against the best competition in the country, like Cincinnati with Oscar Robertson here. The Dixie Classic brought national attention and trouble.
The Dixie Classic was the best college basketball tournament in the country. The ACC tournament was the best postseason tournament in the country, and it was a natural for gamblers.
Ron Morris, author of ACC Basketball and Illustrated History, had difficulty getting anyone to talk to him about the 1961 point-shaving scandals.
Talked to the mother of one man who, she was in tears, the fact that someone would bring this back up 30 years later. She said his life was essentially ruined by the scandal.
One player agreed to talk to Morris about the scandal. Don Gallagher of Binghamton, New York, told of taking $1,000 on several different occasions in exchange for arranging the point spread.
Don Gallagher explained it in great detail. There was a very simple thing to do. He said most people think that what you would do is miss shots. That's the most obvious way to do it and the most obvious way to get caught. He said the way you do it is you just let your man score every once in a while.
These documents tell the story. Gallagher and 9 other players that stayed in Carolina took money from gamblers. Several of the players were found to have shaved points. The players were granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for testimony against the big gamblers. But none of these players' lives were ever the same again, nor were the programs the same.
Yeah, they cut back the schedules. North Carolina played 17 games in 1961, as it did NC State. They cut back on recruiting. Everett Case's health was never the same at NC State. And some people think the point-shaving scandal basically took him out of coaching. Frank McGuire left North Carolina.
Both State and Carolina restored respectability to their programs in the years following the scandals, and those who remember the hurt of 1961 hope nothing like this happens again. Bob Holliday, WRAL TV5 Sports.
Fast forward to 1971 and the Big Four tournament, where North Carolina, NC State, Duke, and Wake Forest played each other in Greensboro. This is where the key ingredients of the rivalry dynamics you know today were thrown in. And by the time the 70s were coming to a close, coaches hated it. Just listen to Dean Smith.
I personally would rather play the top 2 teams in the country. Who are they right now? Kentucky and DePaul. Much rather than playing Duke and either Wake or State. Simply because we play them so often, and I think I'm all for the Big Four tournament. As soon as we play them 4 times in basketball, then we start playing football 3 times, and we'll all be happy. But
Norm Sloan, NC State's basketball coach from 1966 through 1980, put it best the year before the Big Four tournament ended in the 80-81 season. You're going to find out real quick what kind of team you had.
Never have objected to the tournament. I think anything that commands the attention of the media and the fans, to the extent that the Big Four tournament does, it has to be good for basketball, and therefore it's good for people who are in the basketball business. I just haven't liked the idea that the last few years we've had to open the season with the Big Four tournament. And the irony of the whole thing is, next year, the year that's going to be the last year of the Big Four, it's opened 1 week later, so we'll have a chance to schedule at least 2 games before we go into Big Four competition. Back when the Big Four tournament was held the first week in January, I thought it was an ideal situation. A tough way to open the season, but by the same token, you won't have to wait until you meet a team later on down the road to find out what you really have, what's strong and what's weak for you. Decisions made based on what happens in this game can be valid decisions, because a lot of times you open with an opponent, maybe you're 25, 30 points better than they are, and then you come out of the game saying, I was pleased with this, pleased with that, but I'm going to have to wait and see until we get up against a stronger ball club whether this is going to hold up or not. We're going to get a very valid look at what we have as strengths and weaknesses, I think, in this opening game. Now, our ball club is going to get better as the season goes on.
Wake Forest had the most Big Four tournament championships with 4. NC State had 3. North Carolina and Duke each had 2. But as Sloan put it, winning the thing was fine. There was just one thing you couldn't do.
Pressure game in the Big Four tournament is not the opening game or the championship game. It's the consolation game. Because what you don't want in the Big Four tournament is to come out there 0-2. Somebody's going to. There's going to be a 2-0, 2 1-1s, and an 0-2. 2 years ago, we came out of there 0-2, and that year we happened to have a lot of problems in our program here at North Carolina State. And I really think that 0-2 start played a major role in a lot of the problems we had that year. So the pressure game over there in the Big Four tournament will be the consolation game. People will not be going in employing any strategy. You're going to go in there and do the thing that you think you can do best at this particular time. Strategy may come on down the road.
A brief history of triangle sports is an idea I had back in 2014. But, well, I got distracted by other things and I did not follow through. But we're doing it today. I wanted to do something like this because longtime News and Observer columnist Caulton Tudor had recently joined Capital Broadcasting. Here's a guy who had covered 35 ACC basketball tournaments, 24 Final Fours. He started his career around the time of the Big Four tournament beginning and the arrival of ACC legend David Thompson. I didn't want Tudor's experience lost to time or buried in the labyrinth of trying to find old columns on the internet. I wanted to talk to him about this, and for all of us to have a reference point to how we got here. Caulton, you come from a time where the college basketball season in this area had a lot more anticipation than it does today. I am in an era where we'll get around to college basketball once the college football season ends. I know the games have been played. I've already watched State play, and I've already watched Carolina play, but I'm not fully into it yet, and I probably won't be until around Christmas time. That wasn't always the case.
Oh, absolutely not, Joe. Until into the 90s, the very first games, the very first basketball games were always after football was over.
Mm-hmm.
And usually December 1st, that was the signal day. And people waited for it because the football teams in this area in those days were basically like they are now.
Mediocre?
Well, actually, Duke was the kingpin there. So things haven't changed. Yeah, I went back and looked it up. The very first game that Dean Smith ever coached at UNC as a head coach at college was December 2nd, 1961, and it was a conference game, and that was an opening game of the season. And they had to play Virginia. They beat them easily, but that was at a time when UNC was on de-emphasis because of the gambling scandals that resulted from the Dixie Classic. But the entire dynamic of the basketball early season. Today, it is more like December and maybe November and December, or sort of like quasi-exhibition season. They're obviously more important than that with the Big Ten Challenge, where you can get a quality win or a bad loss. You can get bad losses. The worst thing about the downside of this is the way the season is structured today, where most of the teams in the ACC, or a lot of the teams in the ACC, play fairly weak November, December schedules. Is if you lose one of those if you get an ugly loss now, it just rides with you forever. It takes you, you've got to have. If you have a really bad December loss on your NCAA resume, you've almost got to get 2 conference road wins to get rid of the thing.
When did you start seeing the change locally? I mean, you've been covering college sports in this area since 1970, and it's always been, as you said, up until the 90s. When can you pinpoint the time when college basketball in the Triangle didn't have an anticipation level like you were used to seeing in the 70s and the 80s, even in the 90s?
Well, in a way, the forerunner of it was the great state teams of 73 and 74, which their preseason conference schedules were really weak, and they started getting extended a little bit. Other than the Big Four tournament, Norm Sloan Sports Illustrated ran this famous story which infuriated state fans, actually infuriated ACC fans, but it really infuriated state fans, and it was called the kennel ration schedule, the one dog food after another, and, where Norm would play like Columbia State and Savannah Tech, but he would explain it by saying, "Look, I've got to play the Big Four tournament, which nobody in the country has to do anything. Nobody has to go through that except 4 of us." And so Norm would line up these really easy teams, and that sort of started to begin to take away a little bit of the anticipation. After that, there was a period when the Big Four tournament was played at the very start of the season, the very opening game of the season. It was played like the middle of December and then eventually into early January and then back to the front of the season over 10 years. And during that period where Norm would schedule these real lightweights, but he didn't have to worry about it. He knew he had the best team in the ACC, and he had the best team in the country.
Well, yeah.
2 seasons, maybe.
So the Big Four tournament, we hear, people like me, I didn't grow up in this area, but you hear about the Big Four tournament. And I'm thinking to myself, what was it? Was it like its own offshoot?
Oh,
it didn't count towards conference standings? It happened at the beginning of the season?
It was an entity.
And the coaches were cool with this?
They were not cool with it. Dean Smith hated it so bad.
So why were they doing it?
Because money. In those days, it was much harder to get a ticket to the Big Four tournament than it was to get a ticket to the ACC tournament, and was damn near impossible to get a ticket to the ACC tournament.
True.
So,
now it's a piece of cake.
And TV, it was only I'm not even sure the first – in 71, I'm not even sure the first Big Four tournament was on anything other than regional TV with Raycom, Jefferson Pilot in those days. And it was such a big it was a cash cow. I mean, they would allocate that Coliseum to Greensboro, which even then seated like 17,000. They would go 4,000, 4,000, 4,000, 4,000, and hold out 1,000 to sell to the highest corporate bidder. You'd have those furniture manufacturers over in High Point and Greensboro area just bidding. I mean, I'm not sure how. Bob James was a genius when it came to that, but he was the commissioner of the ACC. But it was brutal. I mean, it was. I went back and looked at this thing, Joe, in the 1979-80 basketball opening games for the Big Four on November 30th. UNC had to start against NC State in Greensboro in the Big Four, and UNC. It was a brutal. I've covered the game. It was a physical. Basketball was a lot more physical then than it is now.
And people are surprised by that. Still.
But UNC won that game, pulled away at the end, won 97-84. The very next night in the championship, UNC won. By that time, they were calling it the double headers, but it didn't make any difference. It's still a tournament.
Yeah.
But the very next night, they had to go out and play Duke. I mean, and it was a bloodbath. And Duke beat them at the end. Duke pulled away at the end, and it was an absolute bloodbath.
So, do you remember when the Big Four tournament ceased?
That was the following year.
Okay.
The coaches were up in arms. But at that point, everybody was mad. I mean, it started with Dean. Dean didn't really even – Dean wasn't around for the Dixie Classic, but he was an assistant. And Frank McGuire hated the Dixie Classic, even though he won it 2 or 3 times. But he hated having to come over here and play 3 games on NC State's court and then come back in March and play the ACC tournament on NC State's court. And, of course, Everett Case, who was the state coach, would he'd fuel the fire by saying, look, if you want to play it in Woolen Gym, we'll go over there, whether you got 3,000 seats, 4,000, we'll try to play it there. So,
but when who instigated the ending of it? Was it a conference thing? Was it just all the coaches once just agreed, we're not going to do this anymore?
Yeah, the coaches just, grabbed their athletic directors by by the shirt and threw them up against the wall, Bob Knight fashion, or into a trash can and said, we're not doing this anymore.
Yeah.
And that was how it ended. That was exactly how it ended.
And the fan reaction then?
Oh, the fans didn't like. The fans loved this thing.
Yeah.
See, this thing actually. When the Dixie Classic ended in 1960, this became the new Dixie Classic, and except it got out of the other 4 teams. It got those other 4 teams out of the way because one of the Dixie Classic format was the 4 Big Four teams against 4 of the best teams Everett Case could talk into coming down here to play. And one year that was Michigan State with Johnny Green. And one year it was Cincinnati with Oscar Robertson. It was the quality of the Big Four. The other 4s it was good, but they couldn't win, of course.
Now I'm thinking about this through the prism of today and goosing RPIs and making yourself attractive to the NCAA selection committee. Everybody's obsessed with strength of schedule. Wouldn't something like this go over well today? Or we already have it in the form of, say, the Champions Classic, where Duke takes on Kentucky and Kansas plays Michigan State, and they alternate every year.
Yeah, the holiday tournaments on neutral courts.
Yeah,
I mean, like the field they put together that UNC was in for the
the Battle of Atlantis was at the resort there in the Bahamas.
That was a heck of a field. I mean, that was as good a field. That was resemblant of the Dixie Classic fields. That looked a lot like that, except there was obviously no home court advantage. There really wasn't a lot of atmosphere. The Dixie Classic atmosphere was incredible because, believe it or not, in those days, the Big Four teams pulled for each other. I mean, the big thing out of that first day of the Dixie Classic is if all 4 North Carolina teams won, it was like a holiday. It was. I mean,
does that exist today?
No.
Nobody pulled. So Duke. So you're telling me there was a time where Duke and Carolina fans were actually on the same page about something?
Absolutely, and Wake Forest. And Wake Forest fans were the most physical team in the ACC during that period was Wake Forest because Bones McKinney had this nasty habit of football, like we're talking about the division.
Yeah.
Football season would be over, so he'd pull over a few football players, Norm Snead, Bill Hull, these kind of guys. And they were just monsters. And the NC State and UNC and Duke basketball players are used to dealing with basketball players. They weren't used to dealing with linebackers and tight ends So, yeah, it was. They all did pull for each other.
So at what point did the division begin? I mean, I get once they would play, you would have a problem with it. But like for instance, Duke gets knocked out in the opening rounds. Mercer one year, and then Lehigh the next. I mean, if based on my Twitter feed, based on the phone calls that we get into the radio station, it was like a national holiday for Tar Heel fans that Duke got busted.
Well, you know
that.
Where I think that started? I think it really there was probably a little slice in it. I mean, there was a little spot in there, but it really started fragmenting the fan support where they would all yell ACC,
like the SEC does for football.
Yeah, right. I think it actually started with recruiting when they were. A lot of it had to do with David Thompson, because when David Thompson signed with State, Dean Smith said, "Well, here's the thing about it. Duke bought him a sport coat, which Duke went on probation for buying David a sport coat of all things. I think because they bought it from some upscale Yachtstabo or somewhere. And and so Dean's theory was that Jim Graham, who was commissioner of agriculture in those days, had the road to David's house in Shelby or outside of Shelby paved. This is folklore, and so I think that was when they started hating each other. And actually, that road did get paved.
Okay.
But as it turned out, it was on schedule to be paved anyway. We had to do a big series on. I was with the Raleigh Times.
Wait.
We had to go up there. We had to go back and look into the work plans and so forth. This had been the paving of this road to David's house actually had been okayed by the 1970 state DOT budget through the state legislature. But it, as usual, it took 4 years for the government to get around to 3 years.
That's not a surprise, yeah.
So when Dean's, made those remarks like, well, it's funny that David ends up at NC State and they paved the road to his house. So that was when it started. Those things started happening. And then, of course, Norm Sloan arrived at State and hated Dean, and Dean hated Norm. And the personalities became involved. It was funny. That was about the time Vic Bubas got out at Duke, because he wasn't he wasn't a trench fighter. He wasn't an alley fighter like Dean and Norm. So he Bones was down and dirty. So
now when you mentioned that Dean and Norm did not get along, and again, this is another example of a difference in how things are covered today and how they're handled versus how they were 30, 40 years ago. It was not a secret that they didn't like each other.
Oh, no. Absolutely not.
There was no cordial,
They did not speak to each other. They would shake hands.
Yeah.
They would make a show of shaking hands before the game. But in those days, UNC didn't shake hands with anybody after the game.
Okay.
Dean's rule was you win the game, beat them to death, or beat them by 1, beat them by 30, and leave. Run off the court. Don't shake hands with anybody.
All right.
And
now, why didn't they like each other? Was it just over the recruiting stuff, or were there other reasons?
It was. I think it was the rivalry of the two schools. I think it was David. A lot of it went back to David Thompson. No, but see, not many people knew how good David was.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't like today. There weren't any 5-star ratings, 4-star ratings, and this and
that.
But
that was a big recruitment, was it not? Or is it only because he was from the area and everybody knew he was a high school legend?
The only people that knew that David Thompson was great were the people who saw him play. So they weren't, in that time, Crest High School wasn't even in the North Carolina High School Association.
Okay.
It was in the Western North Carolina High School Association, which was another entity into itself.
Yeah.
And he played some games against teams from Tennessee and some teams against South Carolina, and the members of the North Carolina High School Association, which were like 75% of the high schools in the state, looked upon that as a bastard organization, an outlaw outfit, and they wouldn't come in under the umbrella. So you didn't get a lot of information on what went in on the Western North Carolina High School Athletic Association. And it wasn't until David's final year at Crest that anybody really even knew about him, except the coaches.
Yeah.
The coaches knew about him.
Okay.
And a lot of the sports writers knew about him. And the only way I knew about him was from having heard the coaches say, this is. I remember the first time I ever heard David Thompson's name used was by Bill Guthridge, who said, and you know, in those days you could talk a little bit off the record about. He said, "We really need to get this kid out of Crest High School. He's a second guard and so forth and so on."
Now, did you go see him in high school at any point? Once you heard about him?
I never saw David in high school because I saw working for the Raleigh Times. I saw as many high school games as I did college games. I mean, it was nothing for me to see 30 or 40 college games or 30 or 40 high school games every season. But I only saw basically I'd see the NCHSAA games. And so I never really got to see him.
So
I got to see, I saw Tommy Burleson play 2 or 3 times because the 1A championship in those days was in Durham.
No, recruiting today, I'm sure David Thompson would have been on an AAU squad.
Oh Lord, yes, he would have been on some sort of the Charlotte.
Right, some traveling team. There would be YouTube video footage of him. There'd probably be daily updates about, on Twitter from the Inside Carolinas or Pack Prize Wolfpackers or whoever talking about how Coach X is visiting this game, and we would know about David Thompson from the jump, and then number 2, we'd be speculating where he'd be in the draft at this point.
Oh, absolutely, yes. When we speculate, we'd be knowing where.
Well, we know where we'd go at this point. Hindsight being what it is,
right. But David Thompson was an urban legend a long time. But in David Thompson's first year at NC State, it was a lot harder, and I'm saying 2 or 3 times harder, to get in there, to get in Reynolds Coliseum in time to see the freshman games.
That's right, because they couldn't play.
His first year, he had to play freshman ball.
Yeah.
And so it was, and I covered one of my jobs was covered the freshmen. I covered UNC freshmen. They were called Tar Babies.
Jeez.
And State's players.
That's unfortunate.
I'm telling you, they were called the Wolflets. State was called the Wolflets. And Duke's players were called the Imps, the Blue Imps.
The Blue Imps, okay.
So I would cover the freshmen. I'd write a column every week about what was going on for a while there, and also football.
And the first time you saw David Thompson, was
in his first freshman game at NC State. He scored. I think they played Edwards. God, somebody's going to get me on this.
Yeah,
but I'm going to say
we can fact check that one.
Edwards Military Academy or EMI, Edwards Military Institute, and he scored like 35 points and only played 2 or 3 minutes in the second half.
Best player you'd seen at that point?
Yeah, and you couldn't dunk.
Right.
And there was no 3-point shot.
It was against the NCAA rules at the time.
And I looked at him and I said, gosh, here is Oscar Robertson with an inside game.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying, that was my first. I said, God, this is Oscar Robertson with an inside game, even though they were the same size.
Now, urban legend says that because of the no dunking rule, there was it was at the end of the season, or it was at some point where David Thompson said, forget it.
This is in the last game.
The last game.
Yeah, and I forget who it was. It was one. They scored like 140 points.
Yeah.
And so Norm set it up because the fans were good. You could go to practice in those days.
Oh,
I'm not talking
practice.
about sports writers.
Right. Anybody can go to practice.
People could go to practice. Yep. If you just wandered into Reynolds Coliseum, you could go to practice.
Mm-hmm.
You could watch. You get to hear Norm cuss a lot. And if things really got nasty, he'd take them to the locker room and blow them out for 2 or 3 minutes and bring them back up. So you had to go down these steps. That was like a drill in itself.
So Thompson's out there just putting on a show for fans that would see it at practice, but then you couldn't see it at games.
Yeah, you couldn't see that dunking.
Mm-hmm.
And then that last game, they gave him an alley-oop, and then rather than going a foot above the goal, to just drop the ball in like he always did.
Yeah.
He said no this time, and he does tomahawk.
Yeah.
And, of course, it's a technical foul. And he gets a standing ovation.
What are you going to do about it?
And, I remember I interviewed one of the officials, and it seems like it was Paul Hausman who had to call it, and he said it was the worst call of his life because he said, I wanted to clap too. I think it was either Dan Woolridge or Paul Hausman. I think it was Hausman.
Yeah.
Who said, he said that hurt me more to make that call.
Does it bother you, or do you kind of chuckle when nationally the assumption is best ACC player ever is Michael Jordan?
Oh,
because we know of Michael Jordan's, not that he wasn't good in college.
He was good.
But we know of his NBA career and how he was the greatest of all time and the rings and everything else and all the comparisons that all the NBA players have to deal with. But locally, I'm guessing that people just bristle at that idea because they saw somebody like David Thompson limited, without 3-point shots, without dunking, still do what he did.
There's no real debate among UNC and state fans to this day of the people who actually saw David play. There's no debate. There's no debate. I mean, it's so clear cut. There's just no debate. I mean, it's like comparing Willie Mays to Duke Snider. And they're both great players. I mean, that's always the analogy that I came up with in my mind because I'm a Dodger fan. I had to bite the short end of the bullet on this thing. But it's exactly the same analogy, and that's taking fans back too far. But the UNC fans always knew. Look, he beat them 10 times out of 11 or something. He beat them 10 straight games.
Yeah.
And that was when UNC was really good. I mean, UNC was really good all the time.
There was an element of scoreboard there.
But nobody – here's the thing, Joe. The most forgotten team in this whole scenario is Maryland. Those 73 and 74 Maryland teams were unbelievable. Either of those teams could have won the national championship. Either of them could have. Yeah. And they couldn't even get to the NCAA tournament. They could not even get there
because of the recruitment.
Because of the limitations.
Oh well,
the field limit.
But one of NC State's teams wasn't even eligible to play because of David Thompson's recruitment.
No, they did get there one year, but they would not have gotten there in '74. They could not get there because of David. And when you say because of the limitations of the conference, and it was the only conference champion got to go. Yeah. But the reason that Maryland couldn't get there was David. Even though Burleson would beat Maryland in Greensboro.
Yeah.
But David would still, even though Burleson was being player of the game, David was still getting 25 points and 15 rebounds and 5 assists and blocking 6 shots and the people the thing that I bristle at to this day is the fans who say, well, when David played, nobody played defense. Well, that may be true. But when David played, they called fouled. If you were fouled, you were called for it. These were only 2 officials. But if you took a jump shot from the outside and somebody slapped your wrist, you were called for a foul. So they knew that. So.
Has the ship sailed for college basketball, given the way that we are so obsessed with college football? You got the College Football Playoff Committee every week puts out their ranking, and we all sit there and we freak out. And the regular season is elevated because of what I find to be a very dumb, lowest common denominator discussion about college football and who the best teams are. Usually it's, well, the SEC's number 1 and you're all terrible, and the ACC has to answer back with numbers and wins and everything else, and nobody wants to hear the other side, and I think it just gets boiled down to really silly arguments. But it's why they're king. It's why they're making all this money. The conferences are driven by football now. They're not driven by college basketball. Do you ever envision a scenario or is there anything that college basketball can do to fix this kind of weird bleed over of seasons, kind of a slow start where nobody pays attention?
I don't think so, Joe.
They started in January and get rid of March Madness and do something like May Madness, push it back?
That is the only way to do it. It's because the ship has sailed on November and December, basically. Even though the ACC Challenge and the ACC Big Ten Challenge and the battle for the Atlanta, whatever thing we were talking about.
You got the Maui Invitationals and all that stuff.
And I've been out there for the Maui, and it's really cool. Sure. I mean, except it's played in the high school gym, which is about the size of the studio. And
but you get to see coaches in Hawaiian shirts.
And nobody
doesn't want to see that.
Who wants to be inside in Maui?
Details.
I think they have lost November, and they probably lost at least half of December. I think there's a way to go back after the conference football championship games have been played, basically starting the weekend of the Heisman Trophy presentation, which is normally the second weekend in December. I think there's a way to move back to there and then play quality games and salvage it. But as you say, you may have to turn March Madness into April anxiety or whatever you come up with.
I would say May Madness would probably be the best move
to do it. And and I think that would be a good idea. I really do believe it. But to do that, CBS is going to have to sign off on it, and then ESPN's got to sign off on it because ESPN's got all the regular season rights. And the coaches have to sign off on it.
Well, coaches are going to do what they did with the Big Four. If it's making you money and that's how you make your revenue, you're going to stomach whatever issues you have with it. And right now, CBS is paying a lot of money to have that NCAA tournament in March and all the branding that goes along with it. The NCAA owns the rights to the name and everything. There's a lot riding on that month for the NCAA, even if that's usually the only time that the casual fan seems to watch any college basketball.
Yeah, I agree with you. And indirectly, I guess we're both CBS people. So, but the March Madness.
Yes, WRAL does not complain about the March ratings.
No.
Nor do we on 99.9 The Fan.
Well, this will be edited out.
No, it's fine. We fully admit that we love our March ratings.
One thing about March Madness for CBS that's so beautiful is it sets up tradition like
for the Masters,
none other, whatever that line is. I keep
Jim Nance is out there
every time I get it wrong. Somebody corrects me. But
you have the little piano playing out and the beautiful shots of Augusta, and it's a tradition
can you
unlike
imagine
any other.
this April when Tiger will probably make his return?
Yeah.
Then CBS will every time there's a halftime timeout or 4-minute timeout in basketball, we're going to get a reference to. Here's Augusta the way it looks now, and here's the way Augusta looks when Tiger's going to be here, and so that part of it would have to be resolved, and that would be pretty hard.
In your conversations with coaches, what would they like?
I think the coaches, what the coaches don't like is the short turnarounds. I think that's one reason why the ACC is going to the Saturday night championship game, and the coaches don't like what the coaches hate most right now. If you had to cut all their veins except for Mike Krzyzewski, they hate conference tournaments. They hate them. They hate them as badly as Dean Smith hated the Big Four.
Yeah.
And so I think if you could do away with that weekend, the coaches would be happy with any sort of scenario.
Why do they hate the conference tournament?
They don't want to have to play 4, 5, 6, and the bigger the conferences get.
Well, I guess, but the coaches who are in a position where they know they're going to make the NCAA tournament, they probably are in that position where they don't like the conference tournaments because it could tire out their team. I could see where Roy Williams has never been a fan of the conference tournament.
He hates it. But that comes from Dean hated it too. So,
but if you're Mark Gottfried and the ACC tournament is kind of like the reason why you win 1 or 2 that elevates you above another bubble team, you probably love the conference tournament.
Hey, what about Sidney Lowe? He almost won 2 ACC tournaments from coming completely out of right field.
Yeah.
But by and large, the power coaches. Well, you're right. I'm sorry. I should have. The power coaches. The power coaches don't like the conference tournaments. They don't like that weekend.
Mm-hmm.
They don't like getting people hurt, which has happened in the ACC tournament so many times. You can the national championship so many times has gone through the ACC tournament via injury.
Yeah.
So many times you can't even. So they don't like, and it almost went through it in 75. David got hurt in that final championship game against UNC because I went downstairs with him, and that's how much times have changed.
Mm-hmm.
David hurt his ankle, hurt his knee, all on the same play. He went downstairs with Jim Reebok, and so I went down there with him during the game. And I'm sitting there watching David. I'm saying, David, you all right? And he said, And so I'm in the locker room, and Dr. Manley's in there.
Yeah.
So, that's how much times have changed. So the coaches hate that week where they can lose a player, lose a game, lose their momentum, lose their steam.
David Thompson, I think everybody's in agreement, is the greatest of all time. But it's sports. We all like debates. We always like to obsess over the next fill-in-the-blank player. I know in the NFL, it's who's the next Peyton Manning and Tom Brady rivalry. In basketball, it's always the next Jordan. Eventually, we're going to be talking about the next LeBron. But locally, and in the ACC, I'm guessing there was a who's the next David Thompson?
Well, the first next David Thompson.
The first one.
David Thompson next, number 1, was Kenny Carr, who went to NC State out of the Matha and was a heck of a player. He scored like 40 points on the game early in his career. But really the next landmark recruiting crossroads, there were lots of them in between, but it was J.R. Reed out of Virginia Beach.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the number 1 rated high school player in the country by far, hands down. And it was Duke or UNC. And he had committed to UNC just before, a week or two before the 85 ACC tournament in Greensboro. And this was when the Coliseum on the first day in those days would be full more than an hour before the first game. You couldn't even, I mean, it was packed. People would be out there to watch the pregame drills and hoot and holler. And it started with the Duke 1/8 of the Coliseum that they had, or whatever it was one night. It was 1/8. Started yelling at UNC about the final regular season game, and then the UNC fans, and there were, of course, as usual, the UNC fans had a third of the Coliseum because they get everybody else's tickets. And so the UNC fans started looking at the Duke fans and chanting, pointing the finger, saying, J.R. Reed, J.R. Reed, J.R. Reed. And then the Duke students, fans, immediately came back with J.R. can't read, J.R. can't read, even though he had been accepted to both schools. Well, Dean hated that. Dean knew about everything.
Yeah.
He probably wasn't even at the Coliseum at that point.
Yeah.
But he had his scouts out. And Dean got so mad about it. It stayed he made it into an issue. At some point after a Duke UNC game, he said, listen, JR's SAT scores were higher than somebody else's. It was and it turned into a big it was a big news story. Sports Illustrated did this big thing on it about SATs. And it turned out JR made a legitimate, whatever it was, 1,100, which was very good. And that was before it was
calibrated. They changed it around, right? So did J.R. Reed turn out to be that guy when you saw him play?
No. Nobody ever turned out to be another.
Who was the closest guy to
Christian Leitner, who nobody even knew about. Nobody even knew about Leitner.
That's how it always works out.
Yeah,
it's a guy you never hear about. It's going to come along and surprise you.
Leitner was like a 3-star recruit. He surely had he took pride, and his nickname was the Bastard, and he took a lot of pride in it. And when he averaged like 9 points a game as a freshman, and he didn't talk a lot. He turns out to be this guy that he not only does he lead Duke to 2 straight NCAA championships, he is the guy who can motivate Bobby Hurley by making Hurley so mad that Hurley plays above his head. And, of course, then you throw in Captain America with Grant Hill. So it's right over the top.
And I don't think Christian Leitner's I don't think he still has a problem with being hated or being called that. I mean, he has a 30 for 30 documentary coming out in March called I Hate Christian Leitner.
You know what?
He went to Kentucky as part of some like villains versus heroes basketball exhibition game in Kentucky.
And signed T-shirts.
Oh, he loves it.
You can find, there's still T-shirts around that you can find on eBay where you've got this Kentucky player, Timberlake, and with a footprint.
Yes.
I stomped
Amino Timberlake.
Yeah.
So, in your estimation, it wasn't the actual games themselves, not the results, Duke beating Carolina or NC State losing to Carolina, any of that other stuff. The genesis that created the hatred actually had to do with the recruiting trail.
Absolutely. And, and one day we can talk about Lenny Rosenbluth, he was player of the year in 1957. He was going to NC State. He even came to NC State. He was here. And Everett Case took one look at him and said, "You're fat, and plus you smoke, and so we're not going to give you a scholarship." And Lenny said, "Well, what in the heck am I going to do?" So he goes back to New York, and Howard Garfinkel or some guy up there, one of those street people that used to line up recruits, said, "Well, I'll call Frank McGuire, and maybe you can get in at UNC." So maybe that's where it all started. But the State fans didn't even know that Rosenbluth was on campus, and Everett kicked him off.
Because he smoked, and he was
fat. And Lenny's explanation was, sure, that was in May. I hadn't played a basketball game since March. I'm sure I'm up in New York. I'm smoking. I'm drinking a little beer. I'm eating a little pizza. Hey, I'm a typical New York guy. So give me a chance. Let me sweat it off in the middle of summer.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way, because usually you would think you're sick and tired of losing to a rival and those types of things, and you it's an actual result. Sports is about the result.
Sure.
You beat me or I beat you, and I'm mad about that. Never really thought of it in the context of the reason why you don't like another team, or you'd be less inclined to root for somebody because of some shady shenanigan that took place.
My girlfriend left me for you, or your girlfriend left me for me.
Makes total sense. Yeah, and I guess with girlfriends, you'll do things. If you really like a girl, you'll try to impress them the best way you can. Maybe you borrow your dad's car and say, "Oh yeah, no, this is my car," or you're taken to a restaurant and you don't know how you paid for it, but you just made sure it happened. I'm guessing
this is my credit card.
Yeah, sure. I'm guessing that happens on the recruiting trail more often than not, just to impress the guy. Like you said with the coat earlier, where'd that coat come from? Got to impress him, right?
Most famous one, Joe, was probably, and this was pre-ACC. This was in the days of the Southern Conference, because the ACC schools basically split off from the Southern Conference. But it was in after World War II, 1947-48. Bill George from Pennsylvania was one of the top linebackers in the country. Well, I mean, he was one of the top football players in the country. And P. Ed Walker, who was the coach at Wake Forest, somehow the other got this kid. He got Bill George to come visit. And Wake Forest at those days was in Wake Forest, North Carolina. It was a small little church campus, and they had a little stadium out there, but it wasn't very big.
Wake Forest today is a nice suburb. They've got some cool little restaurants out there. It's got a nice little downtown with some craft
nice
shops.
Seafood restaurant.
Oh yeah, no, Wake Forest is this cute little town now that people like to live in.
In those days, it was in the woods.
Okay,
believe me, it was more rural than Harnett County almost, even though it was in Wake County. So P. Ed Walker, who was the coach at Wake Forest, picks up. This is a true story. Picks up Bill George at the airport, and in those days, Raleigh-Durham Airport was about the size of the parking lot. And he says, he says, this guy's from Pennsylvania, and Wake Forest is used to recruiting guys from Rocky Mount and Dunn and Anger. Mm-hmm. And so he says, on the spur of the moment, this P. Ed Walker swore this was true today. He died, which is infamous too. Took Bill George, got him in the car and took him over to Duke and showed him around, showed him all those Gothic buildings, showed him Wade Stadium, and showed him all this stuff.
Which in the late 40s is this gorgeous football facility that Rose Bowls were played in.
Yeah, I mean, it was like it was like the Taj Mahal compared. And so he said, "Look, he said, what this is where you'll be playing." He wasn't lying, because he would play if he played two games.
True. You would pay them a visit.
He said, sign right here, and Bill George, who turns out to be an NFL Hall of Famer.
Yes, he is.
Signs and told the story, and I've heard Bill George, him tell this story. He said he got to Wake Forest and found, where the heck am I? What is this? Where's all this stuff? He found out it only until he took his first visit to Duke to play a game did he figure out that he had taken his official campus visit to Duke, but ended up signing with Wake Forest. So that's one of the greatest. To this day, it's still an immortal, and I'm sure it's been duplicated. The same scenarios probably happened, but that actually did happen. And P. Ed Walker admitted to it.
Caulton Tudor was born in Anger. He graduated from East Carolina. He started covering sports for the Raleigh Times in 1970, the lead sports columnist for the News and Observer for more than 20 years after the two newspapers merged in the 1980s. He helped me here at Capitol Broadcasting, and he was the inspiration for this podcast. Tudor was one of a kind. He passed away in 2017, but he will not be forgotten.
A brief history of Triangle Sports, sponsored by Copiers Plus, your local office equipment and solutions provider. Take the mystery out of your printing expenses by scheduling your free print audit today at copiers-plus.com.